So if you're a 1e5 player, you've probably faced off against the Vienna game on a whole bunch of occasions. That happens straight away on move 2 after e4, e5, knight to c3. And after we play a natural move like knight to f6, one very popular aggressive continuation is the so-called Vienna Gambit, which happens after the move f4. To add to the natural popularity of gambit lines amongst beginner and intermediate players, this particular line is a favorite of Levi Rosman, aka Gotham Chess, who runs the most popular YouTube chess channel today. In fact, he made a video recommending this line a couple of years ago that has over 2 million views, so for sure the popularity of this line is here to stay. The good news for you as a 1e5 player is that if you know how to play against this line, you can get an equal or better position right off the bat. So in this video, we're going to show you how to do just that. The first thing that is really important to know about this position is that you should not take the pawn on f4. If you take the pawn on f4, then white plays e5, and this is one of the reasons why white players love to play this gambit line, because suddenly they can get a much better position straight away. The black knight has no forward squares because these are covered by the white queen, while the d5 and e4 squares are covered by the white knight. That means you have to retreat to g8, and that's an opening disaster immediately. So what should you do? Well, if we go back, the best way to play here is to counterattack in the center, and the important move is pawn to d5. So we ignore the fact that our pawn on e5 can be captured because we can just recapture the pawn on e4. Nevertheless, that particular sequence of moves is the most popular line, known as the main line. But before we jump into the main move, we should look at white's other options. The main alternative to that is that white captures the pawn here on d5. Now, after this, we will capture on d5, and again, there's a fork in the road where white can take the pawn on e5, or they can take the knight on d5. These moves are equally popular, but probably this one is least bad. But nevertheless, black is already doing better. Let's show why. So the first one we can examine is knight takes knight. Now, after knight takes knight, our queen jumps to the center of the board. And this is one of those instances where it's okay to have the queen in the center of the board, because with the knight being gone, our queen is actually not so easy for white to harass. And at the same time, the queen pressures the pawn on g2 and defends the pawn on e5. So what white does here is they usually capture the pawn on e5, and we could just take the pawn. But even better than taking the pawn is to focus on our development. Now, after knight c6, there's one key trick to remember if you're black, which is when white develops their knight to f3, do not take this pawn. That would be a huge blunder, because suddenly our king and our knight are stacked up, and after queen e2, it turns out that we have no good way of saving our piece. The point is, if we defend the knight, then white will go d4, and the d4 pawn is defended by the knight, and we're down a piece. So this is a very important trick to remember. So instead of taking the pawn, we again develop, and this time we put the knight under a lot of pressure. Now, white usually solves that pressure, but we can now capture the pawn on e5. The reason why we can take it now is that if white takes us here, then after queen takes e5, our bishop isn't falling because of the pin. And in fact, we would have a really good position here because white is struggling to bring their king to safety because of this pin on e2. So instead of taking us here on e5, what they generally do is they castle. But this actually can land them into a lot of trouble very quickly, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to capture on f3. Now bishop takes f3 and bishop takes f3, and we give them a choice. Of course, they could take with the pawn, but then their kingside pawn structure would be ruined. So usually they take with the rook or with the queen. Now, taking with the rook is, in my opinion, less intuitive. I would think, just take with the queen, get some pieces off the board, would make the most sense. But in fact, taking with the rook is the least bad option. The reason why taking with the queen is really bad is that now we have this nasty check. Now that forces the king to move to h1, where it becomes vulnerable to back rank mating ideas. And we just get rid of the queens, and now we just castle. And the point is that black has this idea of going rook e8 to e1. So as white might try a move like, let's say, d3, now black plays rook e8, threatening rook e1, and white can stop that idea by activating the rook on a1. But the problem that white faces here is that we get our rook onto e2. So we either get it onto the back rank for white, which would be the end of the game, or we get it onto our 7th rank, where it's extremely powerful and white is just under horrible pressure for the rest of the game. But we had said that rook takes f3 instead of queen takes f3 was the better play. So let's go back and take a look at that. So as we go back here, we see this was the position here, and now white plays the move rook takes f3. Why is this a little bit better? Well, the reason is that after bishop c5 check, white has to move the king away to h1, but after castle, the presence of the queen makes it a little bit more difficult for us to invade. Nevertheless, after some sequence of moves like, let's say, c3 here, rook e8, d4, white grabbing a little bit of the center, we drop the bishop back, and we're actually much better here still because of the fact that our queen is really well placed, our bishop is really well placed, our rook is really well placed. We just have more active pieces, and with 3 pawns sheltering our king versus only 2, we also have the safer king. So in either case, no matter what white does, they're either choosing a much worse position or a somewhat worse position, right? So that's a good situation we face ourselves in. So where did all of this come from? It came from this position right here, where we were saying that knight takes d5 is one very popular option, but maybe not very good, as we just saw. So the alternative that white goes for usually in this position, to avoid all of that, is to take the pawn on e5. Of course, they're facing a whole bunch of pressure against this pawn, so they generally feel a need to react. But if they take this way, there is one concern for them, which is we have this clever move, knight takes knight. And now, no matter which way they take, the best way, by the way, is to play pawn takes c3. This way, it's going to leave their king a lot more weak, as we're about to see. So the best way is to play pawn takes c3, and no matter what they do, we're going to play queen h4 check. Now, this is our key idea. This is the reason why we captured this knight on c3 first, because the knight was covering the e4 square. White cannot play g3, because if they do this, then we're going to go queen e4 check, and we're going to pick up this rook here because of the double attack, and it's going to be lights out for white. So because of this, white is forced to bring the king out to e2. So immediately, I mean, if you're playing against the Vienna Gambit and you get the opportunity to drive the white king out to e2 on move 7, where it's blocking its own pieces, I mean, I think that's a cause to be happy with the outcome. But how do we actually continue here? Because at the end of the day, we are down a pawn for now. So the first thing we do is we target that pawn, hoping to get it back, and white should defend it. Now we play bishop to g4, again, pinning the knight, renewing the threat of capturing the pawn on e5. Now white can defend it again, but in this position, what I think is the simplest way to play is to play queenside castle. Now we're once again threatening to win the pawn. Why is that? Well, let's say that white plays a move like bishop to e3. We can actually play knight takes e5, because the knight cannot take us due to the pin, while if the pawn captures, then we're going to win the queen on d1. So that would be a really good outcome. Because of this, what white does is they put the queen on e1. That's a logical move. You sidestep the pressure along the d file. At the same time, you would love, if you're white, to exchange the queens, but we're going to avoid that by playing queen h5. Now, at this point, white's best bet is to just sidestep again the pressure along this diagonal, move the king to f2, and here we're down a pawn, and you might start to get a little bit worried, but here's the key. You play the move pawn to f6, and by doing this, you create a whole bunch of pressure here, and at the same time, you're threatening to open up the f-file. So the position is actually really, really good for black. Now, the absolute best try that white has here, and we're going to cover it just because it looks a little bit scary, is this move bishop to b5. Because with this move, not only is white targeting one of the key pieces that pressure the center, but white is also looking to exchange here and damage our pawn structure. However, what's important to know is we don't need to be worried about that. We just open up lines with f takes e5, we let them capture here, and we let them capture here. And in this position, we're still down a pawn, but we just drop the queen back. We've got a bunch of pressure here, still on c2, still on f3, and we've got moves like bishop d6 and rook f8 coming up, right? For example, let's say white goes rook e1, now we go bishop to d6, and let's say white tries some move like queen to e4. We can just continue with a move like rook f8 here, continuing to gang up the pressure against the king side, and we're not even worried about the queens coming off the board because suddenly there's another open file here for us to use. You know, if white tries something like h3, you can see how quickly the position would become disastrous for white. So even against best play, we can still apply a lot of pressure and we don't need to be worried about going down a pawn early in the game. So all of this stemmed from the position where here, after knight takes d5, we first talked about the move knight takes d5, and now we just spoke about f takes e5, where we go knight takes knight, and then we have this strong idea of giving a check on h4, followed by a check on e4. So with that, we've covered the two major possibilities to capture on e5 or to capture on d5 here on move 5 for white. But we did say early in the video that that's not the most popular path, but rather the most popular path is to capture here on e5 instead. Now against this, we take the pawn on e4. Now white again is faced with a fork in the road. The first thing to say is that this move knight takes knight is not a concern. Let's say that white plays knight takes, then we just play pawn takes, and now we've got ideas like queen d4 looking to collect this pawn. White really doesn't have anything better than to go for a position like, let's say this, right here. But the problem is we're just going to play a move like queen e7, followed up with knight c6, bishop e6, maybe rook d8, and we have really easy play against that weak pawn on e5 and also against the a somewhat misplaced white queen. So this is something that we should welcome. A more serious try, however, is the move knight to f3. This is the second most popular path. And now there's a very important idea to remember. We go bishop c5. And with this move, we threaten knight f2. Now white has to play the move d4 in order to avoid these problems. And now, having forced d4, we go bishop b4, where we create a bunch of problems against this knight on c3. White has to stop that, but in so doing, that gives us the opportunity to target the center here with c5, and at the same time, we're still putting pressure on this bishop on d2. So what happens? White goes bishop to d3. Now we play knight takes d2, queen takes d2. We take again on d4, knight takes, and now we go knight c6. We're putting a bunch of pressure on the knight on d4 and the pawn on e5, and it's very easy for white to go wrong. Let's say, for example, white tries a move like knight f3. Now, after d4, we're already winning a piece. Let's say if instead of this, white tries knight takes c6, then after b takes c6, we're again threatening the move d4. So the best bet that white has in this position is to play queen f4. However, after this, we just castle, and our position is very, very good once again. Even if white plays the best option here, which is to take this knight on c6, now be careful not to capture immediately because the bishop is hanging, so we'll take here first, and we get a position like this. It's a pretty quiet position, and I'm not saying, you know, black is winning or anything like this, but black is better because we have better control of the center, and the pawn on e5 is a little bit weak. So, you know, over the next few moves, we can play c5, bishop e6, maybe rook b8. We just have nice central control and good play. And let's not forget that white's queenside pawn structure is very weak as well. So let's jump back to where all of this came from. So in this position, we had said white had several options. We've already looked at knight takes knight, decided that's not so good for white. And now we just looked at the move knight f3, after which we have bishop to c5. So that brings us to the main line for white, which is the move queen to f3. Now with this move, white targets the knight, also kind of reinforces a little bit against possible checks here on this diagonal with the white queen covering squares like g3 and f2. For example, if we now go queen h4, white has g3, and you know that pawn is very well defended. So those ideas are out of question, but we have one really strong idea here, and that is this move knight to c6. Super important move to know. And the point is this: we're giving them the opportunity to capture here, and it looks as though we're just letting them win a pawn. But after the move knight takes e4, we have a very strong idea in the move knight to d4. Now, we hit the queen, and we also hit the pawn on c2. White has nothing better than to go queen c3. Now we win the knight back, and we have a really nasty tactical idea that's really important to know. Let's say that white plays some move like bishop to c4, or it could be, you know, d3 or g3, many different options. Against them, we have a crushing move. Let's say bishop c4, we have this crushing idea of bishop to b4. Now, the point is this. The queen is stuck defending the pawn on c2. Now, the queen has no options. There are literally no squares available where it can still defend c2. And if c2 falls, the rook is going to fall. But if the queen wins the bishop, then knight takes c2 is even worse than losing a rook, because now white is left losing the queen. So that's a really, really important trick, and it forces white's hand to play knight e2, attacking our knight. And now that means that if we go bishop b4 here, of course they can win our knight. So what we do is we drop the knight back, and now white has to develop, and now we're able to play queen to d5. And in this way, we're putting a bunch of pressure against the pawn on e5 once again, and black is doing really, really well. We're just going to win the pawn on e5 on the next move, and it's not so easy for white to find a good move. Let's say some move like bishop to e2. Not only can we win this pawn, but we can also go after this awkwardly placed knight, try and play attacking chess. So in the end, white wanted to be the aggressor, but actually in a lot of these lines, as we're seeing, it's black that's the one that's often gambiting a pawn for a while and ramping up the aggression against the opponent. So because of this, what white actually does, if we once again take a little bit of a step back, is that in this position here, after knight to c6, they should, if they know the theory, they should avoid capturing this knight, and instead they play the move bishop to b5. That kills off not only knight takes e5, but also knight d4 ideas. And now in this position, we capture this knight on c3. So this is a really important idea, once again, familiar to us from a different line, where after taking that knight, we would go queen h4 check. It's actually the same idea, but in this instance, we're looking for the immediate queen exchange. So we get the queens off the board. And the reason why this is a good position for us is because it turns out that the pawn on e5 is actually more vulnerable than the pawn on e4. And as a result, white has no choice really. The best path that they can go for is to take this knight, because if they don't do this, we're going to play bishop d7 and then look to grab that pawn on e5 very quickly. So white captures on c6, pawn takes c6, and we get this position. And the reality is material is level, but we have the bishop pair and a second really subtle point that is kind of hard to believe, but in fact, white's king side with only those two pawns is vulnerable. So the way to play here, let's say white plays bishop e3, that's the most popular path. We go h5, and we just target that king side very quickly. And in fact, after knight e2, h4, already white's position is kind of struggling. So let me show you one example. Let's say white castles, we go bishop g4, we target this knight, white has to defend the knight, and now we go pawn takes. Now white cannot play pawn takes because we would chop here on h1, chop, and then win that knight. So because of this, white has knight takes g3, now we go bishop f3, we hit the rook is forced to move, and now we go rook takes h2. So we're up a pawn. I'm not saying it's the end of the game here. White has some counterplay, maybe with knight f5 and hitting this pawn, or then knight d4, hitting this one and this one. Maybe with best play, white can, get somewhere close to equality, but certainly black is the one in command here. And there are other options. You might be saying, well, why did you castle queenside, driving the king over there when your king side is under fire? Why not just put your king on f2? But even here, we still do the same thing, bishop to g4. And, it's hard to see, what does white even do? Let's say, I don't know, white goes something like rook to d1. We just continue our development, bishop e7. Let's say, I don't know, white can try something like rook to d2, but white is a little bit stuck here, So white is doing rook d2 in order to unpin themselves, something like this. But, black can just continue to put pressure on the entire position. Let's say white defends there. Now white can go rook b5. What do you do if you're white? How do you defend this pawn? So even this path, I mean, it's a horrible position here for white. Bishop f4 is going to be met by g5. Bishop d4, might start to be a little bit tempting here, but suddenly you've got bishop g5. The rook is being hit. It's just a horrific position. So this idea is not so popular for black. Not that many players know it, but it's very, very strong idea. Try to keep it in mind to go h5 and h4. That about wraps up the theory for the Vienna Gambit. We've seen that white has various different paths, but no matter what white does, if black knows their stuff, then black will be the one pushing from the very beginning. The reason why Vienna Gambit players thrive is based on the lack of knowledge of the black opponents. Because if you don't know what you're doing, you can quickly land yourself in trouble. But if you do, then it's you who will be calling all the shots. So hope you enjoyed this video. Drop a like if you did. It helps me out, helps out the channel. And also feel free to drop me a note in the comments about, you know, some topic that you'd like to see me cover next. So always happy to hear your thoughts, and I'll catch you in the next video.